Hello all, welcome back to Code with Callan. Today we're going to create a custom resource filter that plugs into the Spring framework in order to always return back our single page application. Getting started first, we're going to create an enumeration class that stores all of our allowed file extensions. So let's create a package called support, and inside that we're going to create an allowed solvable extension. So we're going to make this an enumeration class. We're going to support HTML, JavaScript, JSON, Okay, so what this class does is it stores all of our extensions that we're going to support from our server. This is just a convenient method to return back all extensions. Alright, next up we're going to create our resource resolver. So let's go ahead and get that started. We're going to name it single page resource resolver. We're going to implement resource resolver. Let's go ahead and implement these methods. So path. So by default we're going to be wanting to return the index page. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable index. These are allowed extensions that we just previously made. And I'm currently only exposing API and actuator endpoints. So that's why we're creating this list for. Alright, so let's get started. First, we're going to want to create two utility methods. We're going to have one called boolean is ignored endpoint. And that pretty much just checks the endpoint to see if we're matching. Next, we're going to have one called private boolean is ignored or loud extension. And we're going to use some Spring utilities here. Next, we're going to create a simple method that just creates a relative resource. If we don't find anything, we just return null. Next, we're going to implement a resolve method, and this is going to be called by both resolve resource and resolve URL path. That's pretty much checking to see if it's in our ignored endpoints. If it is, then we return null, because we don't want to return the index page. This is seeing if it's an actual resolvable file. I'll return locations. We return null if a resource isn't found with that extension. And by default, we return index page. Okay, now let's implement our two top overridden functions. This one's just going to call resolve. It's going to pass in the path. It's going to pass in the locations. This one first, we're going to try to resolve the resource. We're going to check to see if it's null. If it's null, we return null. And that pretty much sums up our resource filter. Okay, says we're having an error here. Let's find out where it's at. Right here. So it's in our create relative. We need a return. We're not returning right here. There we go. Alright, next we're going to add in web configuration. to utilize this and add view resolvers. Alright, let's add some configuration for a web resource here. So we're going to create a class called web resource configuration. It's going to implement web MVC configure. We're actually going to override resource handlers. We're going to add some resource handlers. So I'm going to say registry.add resource handler. We want ** resource locations. We're going to put this as class path static. Going to set a cache period. You don't have to do this. I think 3600 is the default, but I add it anyway. We want a resource train as true. We're going to add our resolver of new single page resolver. And of course, with Spring, we need to add in at configuration. That way it's picked up. Alright, now let's create a test to test our single page resource resolver. I'll put it in our test folder. Okay, so the things we need a HTTP servlet request. We need a resource resolver chain. I'm going to set up a method to initialize these. Okay. So our first test, we need to just test to see if our index page is coming back. Okay. So we need a class path resource. We're going to point it to static. Create a resolver. We're going to pass in our request. Our path could be arbitrary. Do a list of, we're going to mock a resource. And we need our chain. This should not be null. And our resource, a resolved resource, should equal our class path resource. Okay, let's run this real quick, see if we pass our first test. Okay, everything seemed to work. Let's add another test. This one's going to be, should return a valid file in supported extensions. And if you notice, we're not mocking this one. We're actually passing the resource to the chain. So first we need to create this example.json underneath our resources. You'll see that we already have an index example in there. So we'll just go example JSON. We'll just make a valid JSON object. There we go. I'll go back here, we'll rerun all of our tests. Okay, everything loaded just fine. Okay, now we should get back the index page. Let me just copy this method here. If we send an invalid extension, so for instance, we change this to MDX, and we look for it, we'll actually get back this one. Let's check to make sure it works. Okay, so all of them work, so we are good to go. So in conclusion, we learned today how to set up an individual resource resolver to always return back an index page except for specific endpoints. Okay. And actually, let's add one more test before we end. So this will return a null resource if the endpoint is available. Okay, so if I go to API, this should be null. Alright, let's run one more time. Okay, everything's green. Well, thanks for sticking out to the end of the video. You'll be able to find this example code underneath the branch of features/webmvc-resource-filter on the GitHub link underneath in the description of the video. Until next time, have a good one.